a tiny country, a lonely language, and a question that trapped scholars for 200 years. Then ancient DNA opened the graves and gave a hard answer. What it revealed about Albanians was older, deeper, and far more shocking than the history books said. Albania is a small country on the Adriatic coast. Most people could not point to it on a map without stopping to think. Its language looks unlike anything else in Europe. Its history is so tangled with invasion, rule by outsiders, and loss that scholars spent 2 centuries arguing over who Albanians really are. Then science stepped in. Ancient DNA, taken from bones thousands of years old, gave researchers something written records never could. It gave them a direct line into the past. And what they found was not what anyone expected. It was not a simple migration story. It was not a medieval arrival. It was something much older, much more continuous, and much more remarkable than the history books had suggested. In this video, we will walk through the full genetic origin story of the Albanian people. We will cover where Albanians live today and why their diaspora is one of the largest in the world for a people this size. We will look at the language mystery that confused scholars for generations, the hard fight between rival origin theories, and then the DNA itself, ancient genetic data from one of the biggest population studies ever done in Europe. By the end, you will understand why Albanian DNA held a secret that modern science had to uncover. Stay with me to the end. This story is worth it. Here is a number that surprises most people. There are about 8.5 million Albanians in the world, but only about 2.8 million live inside Albania itself. That means more Albanians live outside their homeland than inside it. Think about that. Most of a whole people live scattered across the world, yet they still keep their language, culture, and identity far from the country that bears their name. One global ranking placed Albania 3rd in the world for diaspora size compared with its population. Only Guyana and Bosnia ranked higher. You can find Albanian communities in Italy, Greece, Turkey, Germany, Switzerland, the United States, Canada, and Australia. In Kosovo, which has its own deeply complicated political story, more than 90% of the people are ethnically Albanian. That is not a small minority holding on. That is a majority population in a disputed land. And that tells you something important about how far Albanian identity reaches and how firmly it lasts. So when scientists began studying Albanian genetic origins, they were not looking at a tiny mountain group hidden away from history. They were studying one of Europe's most widespread and most persistent peoples, a people who survived 5 centuries of Ottoman rule, wave after wave of foreign control, and all the chaos of the 20th century without losing the thread of who they are. That kind of survival does not happen by accident. And understanding how it happened, both genetically and culturally, is what this video is about. To understand why Albanian survival is so striking, you first need to understand where Albanians live. The Balkans is not just a place on a map. It is one of the most fought over, divided, and remade regions in human history. Empires did not just pass through the Balkans. They crashed into each other there. The Romans took it. The Byzantines held it for centuries. The Slavs came down from the north in the 6th and 7th centuries and reshaped languages and cultures across the whole peninsula. The Ottomans arrived in the 14th century and stayed for 500 years. After them came nationalist movements, the Balkan Wars, 2 world wars, and then the violent breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. Every one of those eras left marks. People were pushed out, absorbed, converted, and replaced. Languages vanished. Whole ethnic communities were erased from places they had lived in for generations. In a place like that, keeping a clear identity across thousands of years was never guaranteed. It was extraordinary. Most Balkan peoples show clear genetic breaks in their DNA history. These are moments when big migrations changed who lived there. The Slavic migrations alone left strong genetic marks across almost every Balkan population. Greeks, Bulgarians, Serbians, and Macedonians all carry those arrivals in their ancestry. But when researchers looked at Albanian DNA, they found something different, something that set Albanians apart from every nearby people on the peninsula. Their genetic base was older, more continuous, and more resistant to replacement than anyone had expected. To understand why, we have to go much farther back than the medieval period. We have to start with a puzzle that has bothered linguists for more than 200 years. Think about how most European languages connect to each other. Spanish, French, Italian, and Romanian all come from Latin. English and German are cousins. Polish and Russian are close relatives. Even Greek and Hindi share an ancient ancestor if you go back far enough. The whole Indo-European language family is a huge web. Almost every language in Europe fits somewhere inside it, tied by clear lines to something else. Now here is what makes Albanian strange. It belongs to that same Indo-European family, but it sits alone on its own branch of the tree. It has no close relatives, no sister languages. Linguists call this a language isolate inside a larger family. And in Albanians' case, that isolation is not just interesting. It is one of the deepest mysteries in European linguistics. And it gets stranger. About half of Albanian vocabulary is made of borrowed words from Latin, Greek, Turkish, and Slavic languages. Every empire that passed through Albania left words behind. But the core grammar and the oldest words held out. They belong to something older, something that came before all those outside influences. The oldest surviving document written in Albanian dates to 1462. It is one page, a baptism formula placed inside a pastoral letter written by the Archbishop of Durrës. One page. That is the whole written record for a language spoken by millions across a large part of the Balkans. The reason is simple. Albanian speakers were mostly rural mountain communities, shepherds and clans with no place in the writing centers of Rome, Byzantium, or the Slavic kingdoms. The language lived in people's mouths, not on paper. And that silence in the written record is exactly why historians fought so hard over where Albanians came from. With no written trail and no clear physical evidence linking modern Albanians to ancient peoples, historians had to use what they had: linguistics, archaeology, and a lot of inference. For most of the 18th and 19th centuries, three main theories led the debate. Each had serious supporters. Each had serious problems. The first theory, and the one most accepted today, says Albanians descend from the ancient Illyrians. The Illyrians were Indo-European tribes who ruled the Western Balkans from around 1200 BC. They were fierce fighters and skilled sailors on the Adriatic. They controlled a broad stretch of land from modern Slovenia down to northern Greece. Several Roman emperors were of Illyrian descent or came from Balkan provinces, most famously Diocletian, who built one of the most remarkable palaces of the ancient world in what is now split in Croatia. Other rulers also rose through Illyrian military ranks and helped reshape the empire. When Rome absorbed Illyrian lands, the Illyrian language slowly faded from official records. By the 7th century, it had vanished from written history. This theory says it did not die. It simply became what we now call Albanian. The second theory said Albanians were not Illyrian at all. It said they came from the Thracians, an ancient people who lived in what is now Bulgaria and parts of northern Greece. In that model, Albanians moved west into their current lands in the post-Roman period, arriving around the same time as the Slavic migrations. That would make them relative newcomers, not ancient inhabitants. The third theory argued for a mixed origin, saying Albanians came from several ancient Balkan peoples, including both Illyrian and Thracian roots. That view sounded honest, but it was too vague. Without hard evidence, it solved nothing. The debate needed something that documents and archaeology could not give. And there's one thing we need to say clearly before we get to the DNA. The fight over Albanian origins was never just academic. It was never only a question for historians and linguists in journals. From a start, the question carried huge political weight, and that weight shaped the debate in ways that had nothing to do with evidence. If Albanians were Illyrian descendants, ancient and native to the Western Balkans, then their presence in places like Kosovo was not a medieval accident. It was the continuation of thousands of years of uninterrupted life there. That mattered a great deal when Kosovo's status became one of the most explosive political questions in post-Cold War Europe. The Kosovo War of 1998 to 1999 and Kosovo's declaration of independence in 2008 were both tied to competing claims over who was there first, who had deeper roots, and whose bond to the land was more legitimate. On the other side, the Thracian migration theory placed Albanian origins farther east and made their arrival in the Western Balkans as late as the 6th or 7th century. That was politically useful for people who wanted to say Albanians were latecomers, and that their presence in Kosovo and other disputed lands was no older than the Slavic arrivals of the same period. DNA does not take political sides. Science does not care about national stories, but it does produce evidence. And in a debate this charged, evidence has effects far beyond the lab. Once you see how politically loaded this question was for 2 centuries, you can understand why the 2023 genetic study hit so hard. It was not just answering a history question. It was stepping into a minefield that generations of scholars had crossed very carefully. In 2023, a major paper came out that studied the genetic history of the Western Balkans in more detail than ever before. Scientists sequenced and analyzed more than 6,000 ancient West Eurasian genomes, along with 74 newly collected DNA samples from present-day ethnic Albanians. This was not some small local study. 6,000 ancient genomes is one of the largest data sets ever assembled for population genetics anywhere in the world. The research team included scientists from many universities and institutions across Europe and North America. They brought together expertise in ancient DNA, computer-based genomics, and Balkan archaeology. What they found settled the debate in a way that 2 centuries of argument never could. The first and most striking result was continuity. Albanians today carry a genetic signature that can be traced directly to late Bronze Age and Iron Age populations in the Western Balkans. That is the very period when the Illyrians ruled the region. This continuity is not some tiny thread in Albanian DNA. It is the main feature of their genetic profile. The nearby populations, Bulgarians, Serbians, Greeks, and Macedonians, all show clear genetic breaks in their record, moments when large migrations change their profile. Albanians also show traces of those outside influences, but those traces sit on top of something much older that stayed intact. When researchers mapped the full genetic makeup of modern Albanians, they found 3 clear layers. Each layer marks a different wave of people moving into the Balkans across thousands of years. Together, the 3 layers tell the full story of how Albanian DNA was built. The first layer is the smallest. It is a minor Neolithic part, the smallest of the 3. It goes back to the first farming communities that spread into Europe from Anatolia, modern Turkey, about 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. These were the people who brought farming to Europe and replaced the older hunter-gatherer way of life that had ruled the continent since the Ice Age. In Albanian DNA, their contribution is real, but modest. It is a faint signal from Europe's deepest past. The second layer is where the story becomes remarkable. This part makes up about 72 to 77% of Albanian ancestry. It is tied to Bronze Age and Iron Age populations of the Western Balkans, the Illyrians, and related groups who ruled this region for more than 1,000 years. This is not a small thread. It is the huge core of Albanian genetic identity. No other Balkan people carry this layer at anything close to this level. That is what makes Albanian DNA truly unique on the peninsula. The third layer makes up about 16 to 19% of Albanian ancestry. It reflects migrations from late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, Germanic groups, Gothic peoples, and Slavic communities that moved through the Balkans between the 4th and 9th centuries. Albanians absorbed some of this, as any people living through that kind of upheaval would. But it did not remake them. It did not erase the base. The ancient core held. And the Y-chromosome evidence makes that base even clearer. The Y-chromosome passes from father to son, generation after generation, with very little change. That makes it one of the sharpest tools population geneticists have for tracing direct male lines across thousands of years. When researchers studied the Y-chromosomes of modern Albanian men, they found a direct biological bridge between the living and the ancient. The most common haplogroup among Albanian men is EV13. It appears in about 28% of Albanian men and rises to around 40% in Kosovo. This haplogroup is ancient in the Balkans. Archaeological evidence traces it back to the Bronze Age, and some studies suggest it may go back even farther. It did not arrive recently. It did not come with medieval migrations or Ottoman-era population movements. It was already there, deep in the father lines of Balkan peoples, long before written history began naming borders and peoples. The second major haplogroup is J2b L283, found in about 15% of Albanian men. This is where the evidence becomes especially striking. When scientists studied Iron Age skeletons from Dalmatia and Slovenia, areas directly tied to Illyrian culture in the archaeological record, they found this exact marker in ancient bones. The same haplogroup found in Iron Age Illyrian burials is still found today in the living descendants of the people who inherited that land. The marker was there before history was written. It is still there now. So this Y-chromosome evidence does not just point to ancestry in a broad way. It points to a direct father line descent from Iron Age populations of the Western Balkans to modern Albanian men. Not just a statistical similarity, not just a cultural link, a biological one, written into one of the most stable parts of the human genome and preserved for more than 2,000 years. Now remember the Thracian migration theory, the idea that Albanians were not native to the Western Balkans at all, but came from farther east in the 6th or 7th century, around the same time as the Slavic migrations. For much of the 20th century, that theory had real academic supporters. It was also politically useful for people who wanted to argue that Albanians had no deeper claim in disputed lands like Kosovo than the Slavs did. The 2023 DNA study buried that theory. Not with maybe, not with more research needed. With data. There is no genetic sign in modern Albanian DNA of a large migration coming from the east in the post-Roman period. None. If Albanians had moved in from Thracian lands in the 6th or 7th century, that movement would have left a visible mark in their genome. Migrations of that size always do. But the Bronze Age and Iron Age ancestry that dominates Albanian DNA was already present in the Western Balkans long before that time. The genetic record shows no break, no replacement, and no sudden flood of Eastern ancestry then. What it shows instead is exactly what the Illyrian theory predicted. A population that was already there, already established, already carrying the same basic genetic profile that modern Albanians still carry, long before the medieval period reshaped the rest of the Balkans. Yes, Slavic migrations left traces in Albanian DNA, just as the three-layer model shows. But those traces sit on top of a base that was never displaced. The Thracian theory needed a migration that the DNA simply does not support. And in population genetics, when the evidence is this consistent across thousands of ancient genomes, the debate is over. The base held. The continuity is real. If you want the clearest proof that Albanian identity is not a modern invention or a medieval accident, you do not need a lab. You need to visit a group of villages in the hills of southern Italy. After the death of the Albanian national hero George Kastrioti Skanderbeg in 1468, and after the Ottoman conquest that followed, tens of thousands of Albanians fled across the Adriatic. They settled in communities across Sicily, Calabria, and Basilicata. They thought the move would be temporary. They brought their language, faith, and customs with them, fully expecting to go home once Ottoman power faded. It never did. 600 years later, those villages still exist. They are called the Arbëreshë communities, and what survived inside them is something scholars still struggle to describe. The people there still speak Albanian, but not modern Albanian. They speak a medieval dialect so old that a modern Albanian listener would hear something closer to the language of an earlier age than to what is spoken in Tirana today. The dialect froze at the moment they left, and stayed preserved in those Italian hills ever since. It passed from parent to child for 6 centuries without a written standard, without state support, and without any special reason to survive except that it did. They still practice Byzantine Rite Christianity, the same form of worship their ancestors carried across the Adriatic. They still perform traditional dances and keep ceremonies that have disappeared from Albania itself. One major Italian thinker, after hearing the story of the Arbëreshë, called it an anthropological miracle. And after hearing the full story of Albanian origins, the genetics, the language isolation, and the Illyrian continuity, you can see why he chose that word. This is what true cultural continuity looks like after 600 years in exile. Albanians are not a medieval footnote. They are not a people who arrived late and filled some empty space. Science has spoken here with unusual clarity, from the Bronze Age roots in their DNA, to the Y-chromosomes that match Iron Age Illyrian burials, to a language whose isolation only makes sense if it stayed put, to the Arbëreshë villages in southern Italy still speaking a dialect frozen in the 15th century. Every line of evidence points the same way. This is one of the oldest continuous populations in Europe, a people who absorbed every empire that tried to replace them, outlasted every force that tried to erase them, and reached the modern world carrying genetic and cultural memory that stretches back at least 3,000 years. The DNA did not create that story. It confirmed what the language, the history, and the stubborn fact of Albanian survival had always suggested. If this story meant something to you, pass it on to someone Albanian, or to someone who thinks they already know European history. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. There are more secrets buried in ancient DNA. We are only getting started. 3,000 years later, the signal still stands. The language survived. The bloodline held. And the story was real. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one.